unfair to them. So it is our responsibility to spread the word, and inshallah that will be a basis for a lot of work. And we need to be proud of what we have done, what we are doing today, and we are truly the ambassadors of the Prophet ﷺ. We are the Khalifa. So there's a great responsibility on us, not just to have a good life and eat biryani and have parties, but we have a big job to do to change this world, bring the principles of Islam in our day-to-day lives, and show the example of the Prophet, how he was the greatest general, the greatest father, the greatest leader, the greatest servant of society, how he brought social justice. So we have a lot of responsibilities, and this book, inshallah, will help us lead in that direction. And I could go on and on, but I'm going to just end with one more important thing which I learned writing this book. Is I said, what was it that this was an era where all these brilliant people came? Were they an unusual breed of people? Were they genetically different? What was the factor which made them so great? And I came to the simple conclusion is they got the environment to do it. Their greatness shone because they got the environment to do the work. They were not anything extraordinary. And I believe that in today's age, if we give these young people the right environment, we can produce Ibn Sina's and the Haravis in our generation, inshallah. And with that, I'll pass on to Dr. Esposito. It will take me about 5 hours to just talk about this man, what he has done. But beyond doubt, he is the greatest contemporary scholar who has brought Islam to the public world, in this country and the West. Beyond doubt. You read his 55 books, and I understood Islam better reading his book and his audio books than a lot of the big alims that you have written, because he appeals to your heart and talks to you. So, and even today, he's actively working to support Islam. He's fighting for Palestine. He's fighting for the human rights. So that is, to me, not a scholar, but a leader and an activist, as Dr. Esposito is.
Welcome. I'm delighted to be here today. When I went to graduate school, well, I mean, I should give you a sense of where my background is. But the first part of my background I never discussed in the first 20, 30 years of my professional life, for reasons which you will understand when I refer to them. My goal in life, from the age of 5th grade to the age of 24, was to be a Franciscan priest. And I spent from the age of 14 to the age of 24 away, studying to be a priest in monasteries, etc. And I never brought that up for a variety of reasons, because when I first got into talking about Islam, even when I went into Muslim countries, the last thing you wanted to say is what I just said, because already they were thinking, this guy's a Christian, he's come here, you know, what's the real reason for this, you know? Is it, as they said in Pakistan, I had a beard for a long time, because as a Franciscan I had it. Then I took it off, I married my wife, and I grew my beard back. And it was during the time of Vietnam. I had a big beard, I had long hair, and this Pakistani newspaper guy said, so why are you here? Who sent you? I said, well, you know, I'm here to do X. He said, it was clear that it was the CIA. And I said, why the CIA? He said, look at your beard. They trained you how to cut it, like Paka Muslim. I looked at him and I thought, oh my God, where do I go from here? You know, he's a journalist, you know what he's going to do. So basically, when I left the monastery, and met my wife. We will be married 59 years in July. This isn't being recorded, is it? Okay.
No press.
Well, I came out. I didn't intend to get into the first part, but I like it. I came out and I thought, I'll work with young people. So I went up to the parish hall, the priest house. I rang the doorbell and she answered the door. That was it. Beautiful blonde. Of course, I married her for the brains. Every time I looked at her, I thought, great brains. She didn't react that way. She just answered the door. And she went to the priest. And the priest said, I'm really busy. And he said, go out, sit on his lap, and talk to him. Kidding. So she came out and said, Father said that I should sit on your lap and talk to you. And then she got up and she went back to the office, and I followed her into the office, and I said, well, I'm really interested in what young people, she was like a junior in university, what they really think about. That was the last thing I thought about. Years later, my mother said to me, you know, even when you wore a Roman collar, you never looked at a woman unless she was a blonde. We started dating, and we were on a bus, and we happened to be on the same bus going to Newark to work at different places. And she said to me, and we were dating, you know, I've seen her every night. She said, are you telling me that I can't date anybody else? Having no experience dating, I thought, yeah. She said, in those days we had a phrase. She said, we don't even have an understanding. We're not going steady. Going steady means you just date. So I said, okay, will you marry me? And I didn't intend to say it, it just came out. And she said yes. And she didn't intend to say it, it just came out. So that's the spirit-driven part of my life. Okay, so I then went to university. I was trained as a Catholic theologian. I was teaching at a women's college, and I went to get my PhD in Temple. And I was finishing my degree and I switched from Catholic theology to Hinduism because I had a really good Hindu scholar, and he liked what I did. And I went to the chairman, and he said, you know, we just hired Ismail al-Faruqi. It's the last major world religion that we are going to concentrate on. You should take the course. And I was very resistant. I knew nothing about Islam. There was a movie called The Exodus, and it was a famous book, and I thought it was historical. And based on that, and I knew nothing, I thought, why would I spend time? But he was very insistent, so I went to see Faruqi, and Ismail said, okay, so we need to plan your courses. I said, plan my courses? He said, well, if you're going to get your PhD in Islamic studies. I said, I'm not going to get my PhD in Islamic studies, I'm just going to take the course. What was remarkable about this was that studying there was like studying no other place in the United States, which I didn't realize. Islam was not really covered, but if it was at a university, it was maybe one professor teaching some history courses, and the students were mostly non-Muslim. My class was virtually all Muslim, with the exception of 3 or 4 of us, because Faruqi would go out every year and get scholarship money from countries, various countries. And so I basically was in a class, if we had 34 people, 30 of them were Muslims, you know? And so what it meant was that the religion came alive in the discussions in class. It wasn't just I read something in a book, you know, but there were challenges. The first exam, one of my classmates, Anis Ahmad, whose brother was the number 2 man in the Jamaat-e Islami in Pakistan, and then Anis also was very involved. And we had an exam. He said, can I borrow your book? I said, fine. I said, but I need it Tuesday, because I haven't studied. He said, inshallah. And so then we kept talking, and I said, so Anis, you know, Tuesday, and he said, inshallah. And finally I said, Anis, she said, inshallah. I said, I don't want to be insensitive, but am I going to get the book? Am I going to get the book? Years later, I was going to northern England, and they had, I was told a woman would be coming to pick me up in a car and drive me there. Now in the old days, if you were in a major hotel, you didn't see many Muslims at all. But by then, you had quite a few Muslim women who were coming in. Problem is, I didn't want to look at anybody's eyes, because you don't do that. And I'm thinking, how do I know who this woman is? So a big BMW pulls up. Actually, bigger than Annette's.
This big BMW, and the woman gets out and she has a niqab. I said, that's gotta be it. So I told this story I just told you. And she said, she was from, I think, South America, a convert. She said, don't tell me about that. My Jordanian husband, when I want him to do something, I say, I need you to do this. He says, inshallah. And then she said to me, I'm in the back, she's in the front. And she turns around to me and said, and I tell him, is this inshallah you're going to do it? Or is it inshallah you're not going to do it? So I continued in the class, and that was interesting, but I still wasn't going to study Islam permanently. Faruqi called me in and he said, sit down, you need to go and study Arabic. I said, why would I study Arabic? He said, well, the University of Pennsylvania has this great summer program, and if you're going to, major in Islamic studies, I said, Professor Faruqi, I'm not going to major. And he said, fill it out. Just the way he talked. So I thought, I'll fill it out, nothing will happen. And the only reason I went was that it paid you, and I was a young academic having no salary in the summer, and I thought it'd be good for cocktail parties, when I got older. But everything fell into place. The guy that taught me, it turned out, was the deputy director of the Middle East Center for Arab Studies in Lebanon, which trained British diplomats from all over the world, and he gave me a scholarship. But I went into a field where there was no field, there were no jobs. And my colleagues said to me, who were all Catholic theologians, there'll always be Catholic universities. You've got a career, you study with Islam, you'll never get a job. And there were no jobs. Except that Ismail said to me that he could help me. And that is that he had good connections with Gaddafi, and so I could go to Gaddafi's Libya, or I could go to South Africa, the apartheid state. And I thought, that sounds really great. My wife's gonna love that, let alone my parents. My mother would say, my father said to me once, haven't you gotten it out of your system yet? So for the next 6 years, I basically was teaching world religions. We had applied, in this video that we did, my wife was correct, we applied for 100 positions in world religions. And I got a job at Holy Cross teaching world religions, not Islam. I didn't teach Islam other than within the world religion course until the Iranian Revolution. I owe my career and my first Lexus to Ayatollah Khomeini. I do. And there's a great picture in the video she shows of me in Florida in my convertible. I owe my second one to Bin Laden. Therein comes the problem. Know what I'm saying? No knowledge about Islam and Muslims, no interaction for many people with Muslims, no coverage in the media at the time. But when Iran came along, what was the lens through which Americans, think of yourselves. If you live in a neighborhood and suddenly somebody comes from a different ethnic group or a number of people, and for some reason, they're disreputable, things happen. You think there's something about them. It's like the idea of even with the monastery I was in, most people are Irish, and their parents would feel free. They presumed I'm from Brooklyn, I must know Mafia. I must come from a Mafia neighborhood, etc. They were close to it, but I'd always get insulted by it. But that was the mentality. So for Americans, it was every day putting their TV on and seeing Muslims chanting "Death to America," marching down the streets. And indeed, that was the situation in Iran. I may have been the first academic in after the revolution. And when I went to the hotel, you had USA, Death to America. You had all kinds of signs all over the place. And so that was, and then it was America held hostage because of the hostages. And therefore their exposure to Muslims was to certain Muslims, number one. And number two, they could not distinguish between extremists and people who were nationalists and basically unleashing their attitudes with regard to America. Because one has to realize that it was the Americans, when the Shah was chased out and he went to Rome, it was the Americans that brought him back on a CIA plane, okay, with the head of the CIA, who was the brother of the Secretary of State, and they were both devout Protestants, okay. Ironically, the son became a Jesuit priest, but that's another thing. Yes, God has mysterious ways. But you know, that kind of mentality. So that when I went to Iran, I met many people who supported the revolution, but didn't support necessarily what the Khomeini government was doing at that time, let alone after it. Now, what happened as a result, in my case, unlike most people, was that at a young age, when I did want to travel, and Ismail would, if I went to Sudan or Egypt or to Indonesia, he had all of these linkages. So at a young age, I was interacting with prominent Muslims who were Islamically committed, and many of them became heads of the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan or of the Jamaati Islami in Pakistan. I spoke in India to 200,000 people in a field. That's what I came out with. I was the Mick Jagger of my profession, dating myself. I mean, I got off the plane, people were coming back from the Hajj, but they were shooting my picture. You had 200,000 people. I mean, this experience for somebody who was young and your average person back then, I'm not knocking some of my colleagues who were just basically historians of Islam. For many of them, they wouldn't have access. You know what I mean? I mean, they wouldn't necessarily know to go there, but they also wouldn't have the access to it. Okay, so now why should we be aware of what we're talking about? The stereotypes for still Americans continue. So, for example, I get sick. This is about 10 years ago, and I had a meeting, I think it was Detroit, to speak to a large group of Muslims. My wife was worried. I said, don't worry, lots of doctors. And I deliberately said, I'd like male doctors, men, raise your hand. And I said, I'd like wives, raise your hand. Then I said, I'd like children. And after it, I said to my wife, there must have been 20 or 30 physicians in there, you know, I mean, in the group. But again, that kind of a sense was not there. But also what I learned, you know, at an early age, and this touches what we're doing here, is that most Muslims aren't aware of their history. Most Westerners aren't aware of this kind of history, especially that this is not simply a history to be understood as way back when there were a group of people who did X, okay, and their accomplishments. Yes, that should be known, but the point is, when did it occur? During almost this 1,000-year period when the West was in the Dark Ages. When in fact, prominent Westerners, for example, I forget the name now, a very prominent one, never bathed. When in fact, you didn't have the, you know, the kind of excellence that we wind up talking about, whether we're talking about Western literature, etc. None of that existed, but it existed in the Muslim world. In fact, there was a famous professor here at the University of Chicago who wrote a 3-volume work, a non-Muslim. And one of the examples that he gave was that if you were like on the moon and looking down during that period, you would see this backwoods area called, in a sense, the West, and you would see this burgeoning, you know, in the Muslim world. But most of that was lost in our educational system. I never remember that. You know, my educational system, if you touched, when we dealt with the Muslim world in the West, then you were talking about things like the Crusades. You know, that part of the kind of history. Or you might then get into stereotypes with regard to the Arab world. Some of you who are older will remember how often in the New York Times they would have a picture of a Muslim woman, and she'd always be a woman from Saudi Arabia completely covered. And I used to maintain it was the same woman. It didn't matter how many years. It looked like same outfit, completely covered up. But that would be when they would go to talk about some issue that had to do with women. My first book was my dissertation on women in Muslim family law. When Faruqi suggested that I do it, I thought, why would I do that? You know, and then I thought, nobody will ever be interested, you know, in the book. So we need to take a look at that period. And why did that occur, that period? Remember that after the death of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, you then had this incredible expansion, okay, and spread. But it's that period of the Umayyads is seen as an expansion, and an expansion that was military and taking, you know, going in and extending the property area. By the time the Abbasids came in, you had incredible wealth that was available to them, and it was because of that wealth that the Abbasids then could usher in the development of Islamic civilization. And how did that really come about? Basically, they initiated over a period of years what would then come to be seen as the golden age of Islamic civilization. It wasn't just that it was Islamic civilization, it was the golden age of Islamic civilization. The clear implication that things didn't look good before and things didn't look all that great after, you know. So what you then had was they had the money to then initiate a process of gaining knowledge from outside, from all different parts of the world, okay, and getting translators of all kinds of backgrounds. One of the most famous translators was, in fact, a Christian priest who eventually became a saint within the Catholic Church. But it was the translations coming so that you then had language of Syriac, Aramaic, Coptic, Greek becoming the lingua franca, the main language, as it were, you know, of, if you will, you know, culture and learning. They then set up major translation centers, and this is where the creative part comes, because it's not just the idea of language, it's the translation of that language, and then the translation of the language, those sources then becoming the genesis for the development and education of individuals. In other words, the great learning on philosophy, science, medicine, what existed at that period, then gets taken over and then is built upon, so you appropriate and then you build out. It's not the same as, but it's a little bit like, this is not a good example, my analogy's always left, but it's a little like, I knew nothing about Islam, I'm then getting a certain kind of learning from Ismail, but then I build on that because I get interested, and then I go out into the Muslim world, and then I start to see and discover, become interested in, and write on all of this, if you will, new stuff. And it's that kind of change that then becomes important, because what they did is translate, if you think about all the languages that was coming from, Sanskrit, so you're talking South Asia, Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Persian, all into Arabic. Okay. Unless you think that Arabic is the only major Muslim language, it is not. And so as one of my South Asian students who's become a very well-known scholar said to several Arab students one time, because they were going on about Arabic is the key, and of course the Saudis, they have the language of God. He said to them, you know, he said, Arabic, the language of God. He said, and yes, the revelation came. He said, but the miracle of Islam goes beyond the Quran. It's that God revealed it to the Saudis, and Islam endured. Didn't disappear. I said, how did that go over? He said, not too well. But in any case, but it's against that background. So then they're looking at the great thinkers of the past: Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Hippocrates, Euclid, Ptolemy, you know, and also when they get into art. Now, Muslims then seized on that and then became their own masters. And this is where you begin to get these towering giants like Al-Razi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, that still many Westerners aren't aware of. Ibn Rushd meaning Averroes, the more popular, Al-Biruni and Al-Ghazali. But there are many Al-Ghazalis, I should point that out, okay? I mean, who became prominent with that name. So the development that led to these incredible schools of thought in philosophy, science, and medicine, in these urban centers like Cordoba, Baghdad, Cairo, Nishapur, Palermo, Italy. Why wouldn't you want to go to Italy? The food's better. I like Arab food, but anyway, we don't want to get into that. So both sides of my head. Okay, so this is all going on though when Christian Europe, you think about how the French, the Americans, the Germans think so much of themselves. You know, when they put this modern, you know, like this is all their history. They drop out of that past history, and they don't look at very often in our educational system enough, you know, what it means now. To understand how things have changed, 20 years ago, my wife and I went to this very expensive hotel because we figured we should go, and that's when we didn't have any money. Thank God the book sold well after. Oh yes, we'll never see those days again. So we go to this place, and it's in Florida, Palm Beach, incredible hotel, and it's overtaken by what? Pakistan physicians. You know, years later, I have a Muslim Pakistani girl working for me, and she said, you know, it's frustrating. My father's a doctor, and my mother goes every year to find me a boy, to find me a husband. Okay, but most Americans, even when I went there, I thought most Americans just see how many doctors there are who are in their professions, at the head of their professions, and this was 15 or 20 years ago. So it's areas that begin to be developed. Islamic philosophy was indebted to Hellenism, but then it built out from that. And so we then see the extent to which Muslim philosophers, their knowledge later on comes to influence great men. When I studied theology in my time, the theologian for centuries was St. Thomas Aquinas and his teacher, Albert the Great. But there was also Abelard, Roger Bacon, Duns Scotus, very famous, thinkers. Their learning was actually later pulling from what was going on and what was taking place. So these enormous accomplishments existed because you had men of genius, but the amazing thing was that was a time when people could really be polymaths. That is, you had people who could really major and comprehend and excel in several different areas. And I have an example from one of them. I want to hold this. I love this one. That's what we were talking about. Okay, so you got this renaissance of men in classical Islam. So here you've got one. I busied myself with the study of the Fusus al-Hikam, a treatise of Al-Farabi's, and other commentaries on physics and mathematics. So he's got physics and mathematics. Then I took up medicine. Any doctors here today? Medicine is not one of the difficult sciences. And in a very short time, I undoubtedly excelled in it, so that physicians of merit studied under me. When I reached the age of 18, so this is all before he's 18 years old. That was the line that really jumped out at me. I had completed the study of all the sciences. At that point, my memory was better, whereas today, my learning is riper. Let me tell you, there is such a thing as senior moments. Sometimes I kid my wife, I'll say, and you are? Okay. So you have Muslim physicians and scientists. These Muslim doctors developed new techniques in medicine, anatomy, surgery, pharmacology. They founded the first hospitals. I remember when I heard that when I was studying, would never think about the fact that, and if you said that around the average person, if you said that probably to the average physician, who knows nothing, they'd be thinking, BS, maybe that's what they taught you, but, the first hospitals, the hostels for travelers, the encyclopedias of medical knowledge, so much so that Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, was known in the West as the Prince of Physicians, and his work endured for several centuries after. In other words, even as the West came back, you still had in France, that's hard to believe given the way the French are so arrogant and have become even more arrogant, but in France for several centuries, you had his work being studied and being taken seriously. So you had the canon of medicine, which was the final authority on medical matters in Europe for several centuries. He created a system of medicine that today would be seen as holistic, in which physical and psychological factors, drugs and diet were combined in treating patients. I remember speaking on the West Coast at a mosque, and it was memorable for two reasons. One, it was a mosque with a Shia imam, and it was Sunni and Shia worshiping there. You don't see that too often. The other was, the woman that took me around was a young woman who was a physician, and her mother was a physician. But she was explaining to me that while both of them mastered Western medicine, they also practiced the medicine that they had learned in Pakistan in terms of natural medicine, and that she saw the advantages of both and what that would mean. We're only beginning to get around to talking about holistic medicine and what that can really mean. If you're married to my wife, more and more, that's where she's going with this stuff. We have lomies, we have, you know, and things I want to throw out. She says, no, you have to cut them up and put them in that thing, and you have to with the bags, you put them in there. So we're going to spend 3 months in New Hampshire, and they have no recycle. My wife is going to reform that place, you won't believe. We were only there for a week, and she was asking people in the complex. She thought it was just a complex, and saying, this is ridiculous. You got people with money, what does it take? You know, but we have other friends who said it's almost, you see almost none of that in New Hampshire. Anyway, that'll be a rough time. So what we then wind up with is this sense of major contributions to Islamic civilization that is forgotten and that needs to be, again, understood. But I don't know how to say this. I mean, as somebody who's been an educator for 50, 55 years, God, I am that old. Okay. Yeah, it really is depressing. Once you get over 80, then you start to think, maybe I'm getting older. And then in about 2 weeks, I'll be 84, and I think, really? I always kind of hit that kind of thing. That's why I keep running all the time. Because I discovered most of my Muslim brothers, sisters never bring this up, but for at least the last 10 years, it's like, so you retired? And I just say, well, I'm still running 6 miles. Oh, and you change the whole conversation. We don't even get into that question, that there's going to be a story about that. Okay, so why is this volume unique? It's because you wind up having a situation where these accomplishments are laid out, but unique because you have physicians writing them. That is, living physicians, okay? Now, there is a drawback here, okay? They're not experts in this area. Many of them don't have the background, but many of them took the time to go back and then appropriate that, and were able to write a volume that makes for a perfect coffee table volume, but makes for a perfect volume for people to look at and to read. You know, it gets at the heart of things, or at least as they see the heart of things. So it's not highly technical, and it doesn't wind up referring to, you know, a dozen footnotes in which you get bored. It really comes out. And it's been interesting to see the reaction. I had 4 of my colleagues, and I was nervous about it. And I gave the explanation that I just gave. I said, look, because they were like really top people. And I said, I'm sending you this, but this is to be a table book. So in other words, you know, you've got to understand the genre. And all 4 of them came back and wrote blurbs for the book. And if you look at the blurbs, they are substantive. James Piscatori is somebody who's taught all over. He gave up, he taught at Oxford, he taught in Durham, England, he taught in Australia. He's just a very top scholar. Jack Brown, Jonathan Brown, is a long-time convert to Islam. Many of you know Jack's, you know, you might not want to look at his Facebook that often, but depending on the day. I don't look at his Facebook, but I have a colleague who sends me some of the stuff when Jack gets into an argument with somebody, and it's like, oh, I don't know about that. If I got into that, it'd be really. But Jack is a first-rate scholar, and especially on classical, you know, Islam. And so we've got a number of people. John Vole, who was my colleague for many years, is a first-rate historian. So it's the kind of book that I would say, first of all, is really good for yourselves to look at, not because you master all of it, but because it's important to feel good about, better about, and feel you can bring it up with other people. I mean, I came from Brooklyn. I deliberately kept my accent, and I left Brooklyn when I was 14. But I still, if I go any place, they say, you must be from Brooklyn, or at least New York. Okay? And I had just an ordinary education, you know, we never studied Italian history, etc. But when you appropriate, when you're not just seen as the generators of the mafia, but that you actually have a history and history of culture that most people aren't available, that's important. On the other hand, I am known as the Don of the Temple Mafia in Southeast Asia. Gene and I went to this big wedding about 2 months ago, about 2 years ago, and they stopped the wedding because the guy on the stage was one of the members of the Temple Mafia, and we had separate tables for each other. So the reality of it is, it's really good when you get to yourself, be able to just have that sense, not that you even have to say it to other people, but to really have even more of a sense of, my gosh, you know, the roots that one comes from. And also to be able at times to just, when there are occasions when you don't bring it in some kind of confrontational situation, but one is able to say, you know, or even being aware of the fact that if you look at the professionals in America today, the number of top people in America, you know, whether it's in medicine, in education, in science, you know, but there are roots for that. And I think that that's important. And it's also good for the younger generation. You know, I mean, to the extent that one could, but it's got to be framed so that they realize you're not just looking at ancient history. You know, I can understand that because the way I am. My mom and dad very rarely got to see me speak to big audiences because I spoke away. But they came to Maine and they asked my mother, what do you think when you see him on the stage with this large audience? Fortunately, the audience was really good, you know. I didn't get to do the old. I used to love in the past Muslim audiences. The takbir, Allahu Akbar, much better than the applause. I mean, geez, you know, with applause, half the Muslims, it's like they don't even have hands. When somebody says takbir, they know they have to respond. So they said, how do you feel when you see him on the stage? My mother said, at least he has a job. Then they said, did he read a lot? You know, she said, all my boys have to read, particularly in the summer. So they had to come up and read. And then she paused for a second and said, and I'm the oldest, she said, but John's the only one that needed a lot of pictures. All of which is true. I mean, I was never really super academically oriented. You know, I may be motivated at times by the fact that I wanted to get good grades, but not, you know. But when you really can get into something and you have a motivation for it, you know, and a kind of sense of pride, and what that means, and then you transfer that in your identity to then a modern situation. So it's not just like you become the modern expert on architecture, Western architecture, and the modern physician, you know, in the West, but you realize that it comes out of your whole tradition, and that you have a much better sense. Otherwise, you grow up with a sense of being colonized. I mean, that's the result of colonization, where, you know, the whole idea is, if there's anything that happened really in your country that was good, you know, and it's very interesting now when we start talking about, you know, going back. There was some of my colleagues in the field published a book with Oxford. It's called a Festschrift. The German means a celebration. They do it for certain scholars. But the title was like Overcoming Orientalism. You know, and that's what they picked as a theme to then look at my work and stuff, you know, that. Because even though I taught that, I never really thought as deeply about colonization. For example, if we talk about America, you ask the average American, what's the major example of colonization? We colonized the Indians. Hey, number one. Number two, all of those great places that you wind up seeing on the West Coast and other places were basically when you had European countries coming, and what did Europe do? It was crown and cross all over the world. So that really means that, in fact, to be modern and modern educated in those days was to basically be modern in a very narrow sort of sense. I mean, Ismail himself, his education was, he went to a Catholic school, grammar school. I think he went to a Catholic school, high school. And then he went to AUB, which was a Protestant university, you know, before, and he actually, it was after he got his PhD that he then went to Al-Azhar and spent 5 years there. And that's when he actually did his Islamic and became an expert in Islamic studies, you know. So it's a good example of the colonization. Now, for those that are like in their 30s, 40s, 50s, they don't necessarily go through all of that, but they also don't have a sense of that past history as much as they should, you know, and that makes the difference. So, get the book, read it, or get a friend to read it, you know. But I think it's an important part, and I think it should be very much part of where we go from here. Muslims have become a significant minority in America. They're overtaken by what's going on in Palestine and Gaza. They're overtaken by, well, to begin with, the Iranian Revolution, Bin Laden, ISIS, all of that. And so what we see today is, I created the center at 32 years ago called Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. But within it, about 8 years ago, I began a project called the Bridge Initiative, protecting pluralism. The whole thing was to say the pluralism before you say dealing with Islamophobia. And in fact, things haven't gotten better. Islamophobia has become globalized. It's worse in Europe than it was even 10 years ago. In places, like Germany and France and the UK. But you look at China, the Uyghurs, you look at the Rohingya, you look at what's going on in India and Kashmir, and then you look at Palestine, Israel, an apartheid state. I knew in my lifetime that the example I used to use actually is physicians, if you're this, I'd say, look at those physicians who are like scientists and they're working to cure disease. And I'd say, those poor guys, the guys that spent their whole career and didn't. So you spend that whole career, what does that feel? I knew surely in my lifetime, Palestine and Israel would be resolved. And where are we? About a year ago, I spoke in Texas for an outfit that I launched 20 years ago. I was the main speaker when they launched it. So I came to the 20th anniversary. This is before October 7th, etc. And so I gave a talk, and it was uplifting. But then I got to the last part. I thought I got to say something about Palestine. But then I realized, where am I going with the end of this? And so I announced, I said, I'm sure it'll happen. Again, this is before October 7th, within my lifetime. And so you can invite me back in 20 years. On your 40th anniversary, I'll only be 103, but it'll happen. Well, the latest UN study the other day said that it'll take at least 13 to 15 years to restore that whole area that's been devastated, the hospitals, etc. So I think that should be a major thing, for many of us to really be thinking about and doing what we can do. Okay.
So we'll do like 10 minutes of questions. And so any questions that you have, let's ask that.
I have a question.
Yes.
As a professor at Georgetown, what do you think of the current political situation in the Middle East and what's going on around the country in terms of those, what's going on in the universities in terms of those kids protesting?
Yeah, I think that that's what has to happen. I think that it's wonderful in the sense that, but it surfaces a problem. You see, what they do is firstly you develop a word like pro-Palestinian. Now, there's a way in which you could do that in a normal sense, and so you say, well, these kids are concerned about Palestine. But it's almost like that's become a pro-Palestinian, and therefore it's anti-Semitism. You know what I mean? And I think that it is absolutely the important issue. And I in general, I don't approve of people. Oh, yeah, sorry. I don't approve of people who occasionally get carried away. Cursing out somebody because they're Jewish or whatever. But those, as far as we can see, these are isolated incidents. Okay, as compared to the other side, which is you have, first of all, you have what Congress wrought, the Republicans. They bring in university professors, and before you know it, the presidents of Harvard, and you've got University of Pennsylvania, the president of MIT barely got by, and then Columbia, of course, then jumps the gun and overreacts and continues to overreact. And so what we see now is, it is, unfortunately, it is necessary to have conversations on campus that are widespread. But it's also necessary that there really be a kind of organized response. And if you look at I'm surprised at the number of universities and colleges. I mean, Emerson College is now Emerson University, but it's not, a biggie, etc. In other words, you've got so many schools where, in fact, you've had a significant number of members of the student body who are responding. And I think that that's necessary. But I think that the unfortunate part of it is that we are too freely now saying that, not distinguishing between being anti-Zionism or anti the state of Israel as it is the government of Israel, of Netanyahu and his ultra-religious folks. I mean, there's a big difference between that and when you're talking about, what is really the main issue. I see it also in a kind of numerical way that may not make any sense to you. We can look and say that 1,250 people were killed or murdered, and there could be things that shouldn't have happened that did happen. Sometimes accusations are made that now are proven not to be true, but and you should be concerned about that. But when it comes to 34,000 and running, and you've got a president who's looking at 1,200 and whatever, and 34,000 and continuing, and you've got a basic situation on the part of Netanyahu and the government that are really talking about driving out all of the people out of the area. The goal of the religious folks is to actually get them out of Israel. So they're moving them out, they're bombing the whole place down, and because their goal is that they don't want them to come back, and they do that all in the name of security. They don't distinguish between the fact that if you talk about Hamas, for example, that historically Hamas had been an elected government, you had a political wing, and you had a military wing. We have governments that have elections, and they have the military. Now, it's different if you then get a group within Hamas that then engages in actions like what happened in October 7th. One may know why they did it, but in fact, one has to make a distinction. But in fact, everything gets all Palestinians get brushed as they're all Hamas, and Hamas is seen as simply a terrorist organization. That all of the people that might have been members, that are still members of Hamas. And I think that that's a challenge that we have in the U.S., and I think that debate is continuing. It'll quiet down for the next couple of months because it's summertime. We want to follow that.
The schools limiting the voices, those voices, those schools are really going after those kids and limiting their freedom of speech. Isn't this scary? What happened?
Well, no, it absolutely is, and also it's universities that are doing it when they call in the cops, and there's no real necessary, or you have a rumor that a president's going to call the National Guard.
I mean, you happened at UCLA a couple of days ago where the president called the National Guard.
Or the USC situation,
USC.
and now you have universities canceling, graduation because they're worried, about violence. But I think that this is something that has to play out, and then that the younger generation is involved.
Yes.
So I had a question regarding the book. Given the entity that we're in, given the legacy, are there certain bronze or certain aspects of what is here in the building that are featured within the book? Because I know that we're going to be doing a tour of the museum. I just wonder if there's some features.
So you see some of these pictures here of actual surgeries being done by these people in the museum. So there is a connection with what you're going to be seeing. Yes.
That specifically you mentioned in your talk that this Israel and Palestine, solution in your lifetime. Why you are so optimistic that it will solve it in your lifetime?
Well, it's not going to happen. I'm working on it, but I don't think I can make it to 120. I mean, the reality of it is with the level of destruction and with the current government there, right? You know, and with the president, I mean, one of the things. I'm going to address an issue, and I usually don't get into this part of politics. Okay, I was very happy to see how many Muslims in the Chicago area, Muslims in the Detroit area, etc., in the primaries chose not to vote to send a message. But I think it's important, as much as we may have a real problem with the president, not to vote is to vote for Trump. And I think that that's my real concern. I mean, I get so frustrated. Last week I felt like I only could not vote. Joe Biden is a nice man, but a nice man who, like many members in Congress, after 9/11, I was asked to address members of Congress. And most members of Congress did not cover the Middle East. They had a staff person. So they mostly dealt with the important areas. Like when I met with Biden, I was also invited to brief Biden. Biden dealt with Europe and particularly France, and he left that up to others. But what it meant was that when you get into a discussion, the people that actually had the power were simply, if they didn't know it, they'd be relying on who in their office gave them the information. And you don't have to believe me, you can go back and look at articles in the New York Times, etc. It used to be that outfits like AIPAC and others would brag that they had somebody in a congressional office. And what they would do is just send up something, and that person who was there would recommend to the congressman, just take the text and put it on their stationery and run it through. Now, that is something that has brought us to where we are. And so when I met with Biden, he said, first thing he said to me, he's very nice, very affable, but he was a politician of a past age, and he knew how to work in that kind of Congress, but not a man of great, And the only experience he knew was, and it was a good experience that he had, with Jewish members of, who supported him or whatever, But Biden said, where are they? And I said, what do you mean, where are they? Why aren't they marching in the streets? I said, who? He said, if this were Lutherans, they'd be marching in the streets denouncing it. Well, it just so happens in the New York Times, within the first week or second week, a major American organization, no connection to Islam and Muslims, had some of the major Muslim religious leaders in the world denouncing that situation. Okay? But not known. Our media did not cover it. And when it covered it, it was from a skewed. And if you saw the article a couple of weeks ago in which they outed the New York Times, now, not just in the past, that the New York Times editors told their people not to use words like Palestinians very often, not to use words, I mean, really look at the words they used versus the words that they didn't use.
Yeah, just one last question.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I have a question.
Oh,
Thank you.
yeah.
I just wanted to ask you about the book, and it's a very, what my understanding is that it continues the understanding of medicinal contributions by physicians, but also, can you just comment on a look forward? Like, when you read this book, how can we frame ourselves to take it as something that we can be proud of, but also what is the vision we should have for ourselves as we move forward?
Well, part of what's in the book is also to talk about those physicians that have done some major things in contemporary period, that were involved in the COVID vaccine, or that were involved in, so that, but it points to that, but that's not the major focus, but it's really saying there's a kind of connection and legacy. And I think particularly, and I think this probably is something that somebody should be writing about, is a small, accessible thing that really talks about, for example, the number of Americans who are physicians, who are scientists, and who are this and that, so that people really realize that in certain professions, not all, you have a significant number.
And that has been done by Unity Production Foundation, the facts versus fiction about Muslims. So we just updated it with all the current numbers. So you can go to upftv.org, and it's there, and But we need to spread the word to those who are ignorant or want to remain ignorant. So it's our duty to get the word out. It's our history, so I really have to close the session because 3:45 was the end, and Dr. Esposito has traveled all the way, and I don't want to exert himself too much, because next time he will say, you guys use me too much, I don't want to travel for you. So with that, I think we will conclude, and I'm so happy that you are here today. But take this book with you and give it to your friends, other physicians, because unfortunately, a lot of Muslim physicians don't even know their history. They know about Hippocrates and Galen and all the modern physicians, but they don't know that the basis of medicine was established by Muslims. So give it to the young people. Say that you are our next generation. Be one of them, become one of them, and we will help you get there. So it's just a thought process to start. We have a lot of work to do. And as I said before, we came to this country, majority of them starting 60s, 70s, 80s. Alhamdulillah, we have established ourselves. It's the time now to make institutions. We have done enough massages, we have done enough educational centers. We need to make institutions where we can do social justice, where we can bring what the Prophet ﷺ started in Mecca and Medina, and to bring political justice in this country. And we are the Khalifa. We cannot sit back.
Yeah, I was president of the Religious Studies Association. Ego comes here. And also the American Academy of Religion, the only person to do both. But in NASEC, at a certain point, a number of years ago, the complaint by the others was, look what's happening. They got all these people from the Middle East and the Muslim world. Like what? That to study the Middle East, the best way should be that a majority of people are people that have no connection or legacy to the Middle East. Or to study Islam, the majority should be people who, that's changing a bit. I mean, we have, when I went to hire Jack Brown about 10 years ago, all three candidates. And what was interesting, all three were converts.
Yeah.
So, the times they're changing, but one has to be aware of that.
Now, we're gonna have the book signing.
Yeah, I just
done,
have,
and then inshallah.
two announcements. One, the lunch is served, so you can all
Yeah.
eat and enjoy.
Book signing first.
Yeah, book signing continues.
Yeah, first.
Yes. For those who are interested looking at the Quran Museum, they can go afterwards. Sister Alia will guide you there and take you through. Thank you very much.